and gentlemen, to my birthday party, actually. I'm Konrad Reschke-Kessler, the current chair of the JISC, and I work at the Federal Environment Agency, the Emissions Trading Authority, and mostly on policy and legal aspects of CDM, JI, and the mechanism now established under Article 6 of the Paris Agreement. And I would like to introduce to you and to welcome our distinguished speakers. In the order in which they will appear, we have first Gareth Phillips, Chief Climate and Green Growth Officer at the African Development Bank. Gareth's background is in forestry and sustainable resource management, carbon market mechanisms, including the CDM and JI, emissions trading systems, and the international climate negotiations, and climate finance and green growth. Gareth will give a keynote on the relevance of JI to Article 6 and related challenges, in particular the challenges to trading of mitigation outcomes under the Paris Agreement. He will also be the moderator of our discussion later on. We will first hear presentations by the panelists, and then Gareth will moderate the discussion. And after that, we will open the floor to the whole audience. Then we have Aki Kachi. He is the International Policy Director at Carbon Market Watch. He focuses on international carbon markets and international climate finance. In the past, Aki has worked on various design aspects of emissions trading schemes and offsetting mechanisms, also in the framework of ICAP, the International Carbon Action Partnership. Today, he will speak about potential pitfalls for future mechanisms that we can derive from our experience on JI. Then we have Lambert Schneider, senior researcher at the Stockholm Environment Institute and member of the CDM Executive Board. Lambert is one of the most prominent experts who has intensively worked on carbon markets, but also broader MRV accounting and climate policy for 15 years now. Today, he will speak about governance and approaches. What are the lessons from JI Track 1 and 2 for Article 6? Then we have Benoît Leguet, Managing Director at the Institute for Climate Economics, I4C, a think tank on the economics of the transition to a low-carbon and climate-resilient economy, initiated by Caisse des Dépôts and Agence Française de Développement. Benoît has been advising in this field, including policies and economic tools, for almost 15 years now as well. He lectures on the economics of climate change in various master's programs and is a member of several expert groups, inter alia, the Kyoto Protocol's Article 6 Supervisory Committee, the JISC. Today, he will talk about lessons learned from JI for Article 6 and give a brief presentation on the JI reform process and expand on some of the issues we have encountered there. Last but not least, we have the Honorable Albert Williams, Vice Chair of the JISC and Parliamentary Secretary and Special Envoy for Climate Change, who is also a veteran of the climate change negotiations and on implementation on the ground. He will give us some of his reflections from his perspective before I'll then wrap up. Before we start, a few words on JI and its reform. As you know, JI represents just one side of the carbon markets, the supply side. It uses a baseline and crediting approach, and it's different from the CDM mostly in that it is integrated into the accounting approach of the Kyoto Protocol for Annex 1 countries, which of course is based on quantified absolute targets. In this context, JI was therefore already from the start or often integrated into a context of mitigation policies, which could have influences on the baseline, especially if the host country did not want to give out any credits for results that were already achieved by other policies. This is an experience that will likely be quite relevant, in particular for the new mechanism under Article 6.4, where this is a situation that more and more countries that will have NDCs will encounter. Regarding the JI review, the status quo is that the SBI has proposed to the CMP to take note of the reviewed draft JI guidelines as embodying lessons learned. However, the proposal is not to actually implement the draft, as the technical basis for JI will fall away after 2020. And because the review is therefore not actually proposed for implementation, it was not necessary to resolve all the remaining divergences of views. So in the draft, you will find some remaining brackets. And it will be interesting to see to what extent these divergences of views will remain relevant in the context of the new mechanism under the Paris Agreement. We'll hear more about this from our speakers and our moderator. Some words before I give them the floor on the key features of the review. The review implies a switch from projects to a programmatic and sectoral level, enabling sectoral activities and baselines. It involves a switch to centralized oversight. However, views diverged regarding the precise level of oversight. It is clear that we will continue to have conservative approaches to estimate emission reductions, and the draft mentions benchmarking concepts as being one aspect maybe of conservativeness. We had diverging views on how to exactly implement net atmospheric benefits. Now they're called, as you know, the overall mitigation of global emissions. We had diverging views on the transition from the old to the new set of rules, something that may come back to us as well. We had diverging views on the validation and the update of standardized baselines, and diverging views on how local stakeholder consultations have to be conducted and how the concerns have to be addressed. Now, in the presentations and discussions, I personally will be listening to some things in particular, and those questions are: where and how are the lessons embodied in these reviewed guidelines, which are based on the old Kyoto Protocol context, still applicable in the post-Paris context? What is actually still relevant? How can we take those lessons into account when designing a new mechanism? And which new aspects may become relevant and will also need to be taken into account under the Paris Agreement that JI could not yet address and the review could not yet address. Next up, we'll hear the keynote speech by Gareth Phillips. Gareth, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Conrad, for that introduction, and thank you very much to the organisers for inviting me to make this presentation. It's a great pleasure to be here with a panel of speakers, at least at the far end, who I've known for rather a long time, I have to say. And looking along to the other end of the table, what I see is actually potentially, there's 2 or 3 dinosaurs sitting here, and the challenge is, can we evolve to meet the challenges of the Paris Agreement, and can we learn from the lessons that we gained experience in with JI and also CDM to make a mitigation mechanism under the Paris Agreement workable. Now, I used to be very much involved in sort of CDM and JI development, and I was a kind of hardcore mitigation actor. So if you'd asked me these sort of questions 3 or 4 years ago, I would give you a very different presentation from what I'm going to talk about now, because now I've become increasingly skeptical and concerned about the role for mitigation action under and mitigation markets under the Paris Agreement, and it's sort of in my various blogs and things that I've written, I've sort of resolved down to about 10 areas that I think need to be addressed. And so I'm going to just quickly run through those 10 points, and really this is something of a challenge to particularly to Lambert and Benoit to tell us, can they answer these challenges, and can we come up with a mechanism that addresses these points. So the first point, and maybe some of these overlap a little bit, so maybe they don't quite add up to 10, but nevertheless it's maybe a different way of presenting it. The first point, of course, as you all know, is the Paris Agreement is a voluntary agreement. Parties set their own levels of ambition. And this really translates into something of a moral hazard, because if a party wants to sell units, then they can simply lower their level of ambition in order to free up those units. And what that means in practice is that they will need to put in less demanding policies and measures to achieve their unconditional commitments. And in that way, they then favor the creation of a baseline that creates more units. So it's not difficult for a party to come up with a lower level of ambition, and economically, it's a rational course of action. I mean, you wouldn't blame anybody for doing that if you put them in the situation. So that's my first concern, and that's a fairly major one, that's about the structure of the Paris Agreement. The second one is that these emission, or this right to emit that's now enshrined in the NDCs, previously under the Kyoto Protocol, at least in developing countries, these units had no value because obviously they didn't have a target. But now this is a sovereign asset for these developing countries, and it means that if countries want to sell those units, they need to have a transparent way of allocating the right to sell those units. Those are sovereign units now. They belong to the country, to the taxpayers, to the citizens of that country, and they should be accounted for in a transparent way to Parliament so that people understand who and how has the rights to sell those units and to profit from the sale of those units has been allocated. Now, that's not something that we never went into details of that with JI, because in a way it didn't really matter, because we had we knew that there was the excess assigned amount units that countries had to sell, and it was understood that that those would come into the mechanism. But that's not the case now. And so I think this will be a real challenge for a lot of countries to come up with a transparent way of allocating the right to sell sovereign assets. My third concern is around a sale price, here, because of the commoditized nature of the Kyoto Protocol, it was very easy. We came up with marginal abatement cost curves, and we did all sorts of fancy calculations that told us what the value of units should be, and it was very easy to add up the supply and demand and create a curve and come out what the price was going to be, and so on. Now, that approach is not relevant under the Paris Agreement because, first of all, a global supply and demand curve has no bearing on what price an individual country should charge, because what they should be selling those units for must relate to the value of a ton of greenhouse gas emissions to that economy. Now, that's not going to come out in some sort of global curve. And so, you'll have countries that are below that price who will profit from it, and countries who are above it who won't want to sell at that price because the economic cost to their economy is greater than the market price. So coming up with a sale price is going to be very difficult, and it's going to create winners and losers, countries that are obvious sellers and who will benefit from it, and countries who won't. And that will perpetuate this concept of an uneven playing field, which was a major problem under the CDM. My fourth point is additionality. I mean, we've never really bottomed this out. There's always a lot of criticism about the CDM, and it was somehow sidestepped in JI because the units were added to the national inventory, so additionality was less of an issue, but we still use the track 2 approach. So, the question is, will governments just ignore additionality and say, because we're adding these emissions to our national inventory, it doesn't matter, we're making the decision, these technologies in these locations are additional and we're using the money to subsidize activities? Or is there going to be an additionality test that will continue to be challenged? The fifth point is about E- policies. Of course, all countries now that they have commitments will have to implement policies and measures that reduce greenhouse gas emissions. This is the term that or E- policy was coined to sum up this concept. So if you have unconditional actions, unconditional commitments, then you must implement policies and measures to achieve those. And we know from our experience with CDM that they impact upon the baseline. So if you're a project developer, you're going to lobby the government not to implement policies and measures because it's going to erode your baseline. And if you're the government, you're going to be a little bit cautious because you don't want to upset industry and your stakeholders by implementing regulations that eat into their emission reductions and so on. So this whole concept of E- policies, which again, we kind of sidestepped under the CDM, and again, wasn't such an issue with JI. I think that that's going to remain a challenge. My sixth point is, what do we do if a country sells itself out of compliance? What happens if somebody oversells their NDC, and when they come to do the adding up, it turns out that they sold too many units? In the Kyoto Protocol, we had all kinds of articles, I think it was 5, 6, and 7, that dealt with all the accounting and the compliance stuff and so on. And they were put in there specifically to deal with this issue. But the parties tore up the Kyoto Protocol and they said, we don't want that anymore, we want something different. So negotiating these kinds of conditions back into an Article 6 mechanism, I think, is going to be very difficult. My seventh point is registries. And given that we're going to have units that potentially might not be valid because a country might sell itself out of compliance, we can see we're going to have grey and green units again, those that are seen to be of a higher environmental integrity than others. And that means we're going to have registries to track these things, and so we can keep track of where they've gone, so that if it turns out the country is out of compliance, then maybe they need to be cancelled. And I mean, all those kinds of nightmares raise again now under the European European Union Emission Trading Scheme, developing registries in those 27 or 28 countries, I never know which it is now, that was challenging, and we were subject to a lot of fraud. We're moving to a situation where every country is now a buyer and a seller. So creating registries and designing them, implementing them, and keeping them credible is going to be a challenging process. Number 8 is that we're back to this issue about the uneven playing field, and inadvertently, or maybe because they saw this coming, countries have already created an uneven playing field. We have different levels of conditional and unconditional ambition, and the implication being that where you have conditional ambition, then maybe a market can come in and finance that, whereas if you have unconditional, then it's up to the country to do anyway, kind of thing. So countries that have got different levels of conditional, unconditional are already perhaps impacting upon that. And then we've got sectors that have been included in NDCs and others that have been excluded. Those sectors that are excluded would be potential for mitigation projects that then don't have to be accounted in the national inventory. So countries that have left sectors out are in an advanced position, or they're advantageously positioned to to take advantage of that mechanism. So we still have this issue around the uneven playing field. That was a major problem in the CDM. My 9th point is that private sector will crowd out public sector finance. If you open this up to the mechanism, we know from the CDM that the private sector is very good at picking these low-hanging fruit, finding the places that they can make profit. And even back in CDM days, there was a concern that this would squeeze out the sort of public sector projects. And I think if we move ahead with a sustainable development mechanism with sort of uncontrolled private sector access, then those low-hanging fruit will be picked up once again. And that will have then significant implications for the host country, because they will be left with more expensive abatement options to have to implement. And of course, to do that, they'll come back to the donors and to the Green Climate Fund and say, we need more money because these technologies are more expensive. And so in the end, are we creating a situation where the donors end up effectively subsidizing the profits of the private sector project developers? So that's one we need to consider. And my 10th point is sort of this overall concept of offsetting. And I once said, and I think it's about the only time I've ever been tweeted, I said that if we were still using offsets in 2030, we failed. And I think that's still a very relevant point. Offsetting doesn't solve the problem; it just redistributes these activities around the place. And to be a little bit cynical about it, it simply allows some countries to continue emitting whilst others make the reductions. And that's not a recipe for a long-term goal to achieve net zero emissions. So those are my 10 challenges. I don't know, I should have checked if my dinosaurs at the other end were taking notes or not. I'm sure they have answers to these, because I'm not the only one who's come up with these questions. And I think also that Aki is probably now going to give you some more issues, and probably more eloquently than I've done so, and hopefully with some slides, so that you can observe as well as just listen. So with that, I'll sort of draw my comments to a close, but I'm looking forward to some heated discussion. I hope it's already quite warm in here, but we can maybe get a little bit more warm, and I hope that the audience will chip in, whether you agree or disagree violently with my position and so on. I very much look forward to hearing your comments. So with that, I'll hand over. Aki's going to come after me, because I think he's going to also present some challenges to our experts, and then we'll have Lambert and Benoit. Okay, thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen.
Yeah. Yes.
Yep. Coming up. Okay. Yep.
All right. Thank you also from my side very much for the invitation. I'm actually not sure how many more points I need to add. I think many of them have been made. I think I phrased them slightly differently. But I'm very happy to hear that some so-called old dinosaurs are coming around to maybe the more NGO side of things. I think it's a bit ironic, because when I think of Parisian governance in general, I think of the Jacobin and dirigisme and sort of a very highly centralized state. And the Paris Agreement tends to give the opposite impression of what a future world might look like, although interpretations of it are vary quite a bit. But basically, there was a general understanding that if countries could choose their own determined contributions, that would facilitate participation. And I think that's true. The success of Paris is largely due also to the flexibility that the Paris Agreement or the ADP process also led up to countries wanting to participate and saying, I will contribute something myself. But within the Paris Agreement, then you have all various amounts of shoulds and shalls and guidance and modalities and procedures. And if you have a shall and then guidance and then shoulds and rules, exactly what do these all things mean and in what context, and do they mean the same things in different parts of the agreement, and are they interpreted differently in other parts? And how do they really relate to each other in terms of accounting, for the demonstration of the achievement of INDCs or transparency or compliance? And what kind of tools for compliance might we have, or will that be the defeat of things? These are all sort of very large governance questions that really need to be the underpinnings of markets, because markets need clear rules to function. And this is, I think, one of the major lessons of JI that we'll hear quite a bit about in the next few moments. Touching on a number of your 10 points here, I think it's also in keeping the 1.5 and 2 degree goals in mind and decarbonization by the second half of the century. I think it's important to keep in mind also, what do transfers actually mean for ambition? So this has a bit to do with that concept of offsetting that you ended with. But when I have something that's ambitious and say ETS in my country or cap and trade system, how much do I want my mitigation efforts to be undermined by cheap allowances from elsewhere that may not represent ambitious allowances or reductions, real reductions? How much of my own domestic mitigation policy am I willing to sacrifice in order to take advantage of these mitigation options? Again, for the offset sellers, there's, I believe, a perverse incentive to not have ambitious NDCs or not cover all sectors of my economy in order to be able to credit and sell more. For trading participants, even if I've covered all of the sectors of my economy, that doesn't mean that I'm ambitious. It may mean that I have very unambitious targets, but everything's covered. So this is obviously that hot air issue, which we know very well from Kyoto, AAU trading, JI. And then if we consider offsetting under a capped system, which is basically JI, is it realistic to ever think that the strictness of a cap can provide enough of a control incentive or a control measure to ensure environmental integrity of the credit sold? I think it's clear that the amount of hot air in the Kyoto Agreement and likely under the various INDCs, not only compared to actual business as usual scenarios for countries, but also in comparison specifically to a 2 degree or 1.5 degree target, there's still quite a bit of hot air and increased ambition that we need to move towards. In terms of accounting, Kyoto was relatively elegant, I would say, with these sort of clear targets. Everyone had, I would say they still set their own targets, but the formats were all the same. But once those transfers were made, there was fairly clear accounting who transferred what, where, who's taking, canceling, transferring, selling, et cetera, et cetera. But the decentralized aspects, as I mentioned, you have the setting of your own targets, so you could definitely give yourself hot air under the Kyoto Agreement, as we see even more under the Paris Agreement. And then I from the previous slide, the JI track 1, it's very obvious that countries with hot air under their Kyoto target or under their NDC do not have enough of an incentive, just because they have a target, to ensure the quality of the units they're selling. In fact, we see under GI track 1 that is more of an export mechanism for hot air in many cases. So, I mean, just a very general comparison of GI track 1, where we had very little, if any, oversight over the kinds of environmental integrity and quality of offsets being sold from host countries, especially in Eastern Europe. Sort of very uneven application of rules, different. We'll go into this, I think, a bit more next, but it fundamentally, without centralized oversight, you can't expect countries to police themselves, especially when they don't have ambitious targets. That compares disfavorably to track 2 and CDM, where you did have somewhat more centralized oversight. In many cases, much more plausible, but I think that just because you have centralized oversight doesn't mean it's going to be a perfect system. And I think there's still a very needed, outstanding, comprehensive review of projects still needed on more of a holistic scale. But generally, the message is clear. Decentralized governance does not promote environmental integrity and the quality of the offsets. So we've heard a lot about the similarities and differences between Kyoto. As I mentioned, although countries could choose their own targets, they all had their own target and the same target format under Kyoto. That is something very different than the Paris Agreement, where you have a large variety of targets and target types and different kinds of contributions, many not quantified in greenhouse gas terms at all. Under Kyoto, you at least had some sort of uniform accounting. For Paris, it's still a big question how these things are going to be accounted for in terms of the CDM or the SDM or in cooperative approaches, emissions inside or outside of NDCs, and also very relevant these days after the ICAO resolution, how do we account for sources of demand outside of NDCs, such as international aviation and maybe perhaps eventually shipping. So under Kyoto, also as I mentioned, you had somewhat central supervision for the CDM and track 2. In Paris, I think that there is some clearer indication that we have central supervision for the SDM. That's a little bit more clear. How strict that will be remains to be seen, but there's better precedent set. For JI track 1, that was the major thing to be improved on from Kyoto. I mean, not the major, but one of several. And that place, the sort of uncertainty in Paris, where we have less guidance for that, is obviously going to be the cooperative approaches. Under Kyoto, there was an attempt to learn from the lessons of the failures for the first commitment period with the Doha Amendment. It led to stronger reactions from some. I wouldn't quite say it was torn up, but we'll see if the Doha Amendment ever gets ratified by enough parties. And I think we may need to revisit this Doha Amendment lesson for the Paris for the Paris Agreement in order to address the hot air under NDCs as well. And just generally, I think it's there was a large focus on sort of the cheap efficiency of markets and their role under the Kyoto Protocol. And I think under the Paris Agreement is an imperative that ambition play the highest, be the most forefront thing in our minds, supported by the fundamental foundation of quality of offsets and environmental integrity. And under JI, we didn't think about it this much because we expected these countries to be industrialized and developed. But with the end of that bifurcation between different countries of the world, sustainable development and human rights becomes a much bigger issue for all to play, because all parties will be able to take part in these mechanisms. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, Aki, for that presentation. Before I move on, any questions, just points for clarification from Aki's presentation? Okay, so I see nobody asking to clarify. So in that case, we'll move on to yes, sorry, thank you very much. Round of applause. Thank you. So we'll move on now to the next presentation from Lambert, assuming I can get this to work. Okay, here we go. Lambert. Okay, over to you.
Yeah, great. Yeah, thank you very much for inviting me. I will also talk on some lessons learned from JI for Article 6. The background is we conducted a research project last year where we assessed the environmental implications of JI in the first commitment period of the Kyoto Protocol extensively, and based on the analysis, we draw on some lessons learned for the mechanisms under the Paris Agreement. And what we did is we evaluated 60 projects, randomly selected projects. We assessed them in detail. We looked at the documentation. We also assessed the 6 largest project types, which cover about 80% of EIUs. And we looked at institutional arrangements and also conducted a number of interviews with project developers. So overall, the likelihood of additionality we assessed based on the documentation, and we came to the conclusion that overall it's not a very good picture. So 73% of the ERUs we identified to have not plausible additionality claims, and then there's another area, the yellow, which is questionable. But we also found some high quality projects where we thought, yeah, here the additionality claims are very plausible. One interesting finding was that we found considerable differences between JI Track 1 and Track 2. So Track 1 is where host countries have oversight, and Track 2 is where you have international oversight. So on average, the project portfolio under Track 2 had a much, much better environmental integrity in our evaluation and assessment than the portfolio which we found under Track 1. The problem with JI was that 97% of the EIUs were issued under Track 1. And so that led overall to a questionable performance. What we also found is considerable differences over time. So in the early years, the overall quality of the projects which we have assessed was much better than in 2012. And what happened in 2012 is that many projects were registered and issued EIUs which had already started 5 or 10 years back. So they were projects which have been implemented in 2002 and 2003, and suddenly in 2012, these projects got a lot of units. And so the issuance in the latest years has a much, much worse quality on average than the issuance in the early years. We also found differences between auditing companies, and that was quite interesting. So there was one auditing company, Bureau Veritas, which assessed many projects, and there were also claims by some project participants or other auditors about the quality. And that, on average, that entity had a poorer performance than all other entities together. And one particular problem with regard to governance and international oversight is that under Track 2, the JISC had oversight on the performance of the entities, and they could suspend them if they would not perform. But under track 1, host countries generally allowed to use accredited entities that they can perform also verifications under track 1, but there was no oversight under track 1 because the JISC only looked to track 2. And so the performance of the same DOE sometimes was very different under track 2 or under track 1 because they knew nobody is really looking at them. Or maybe they knew, I mean, that's my speculation. But that's what we observed. And that's also an important lesson, I think, for Article 6, that you need oversight on entities, on DOEs operating under Article 6 for all the activities they are doing. We also found some issues with perverse incentives and methodologies. So this is a case of an HFC 23 project in Russia, which had relatively low waste generation rates historically and for a lot of time, which registered first with these low waste generation rates, applying a relatively conservative methodology. And then in 2011, they changed. They made a kind of post-registration change, and they removed all the safeguards from the methodologies, like the caps on how much you can credit. And once they did that, the waste generation rate tripled in this case and went up to unprecedented levels, which it had never seen before historically in the plant. And so it looks like they produced HFC 23 waste for the purpose of destroying it. And the safeguards were removed in 2011. And that's also an interesting example which we found. Another general problem is the inconsistency with GHG inventories. So what we did for a number of sectors is we looked at the GHG emissions reported by the countries in the sector, and then we looked at all the JI projects, what emission reductions they claim aggregately. And if you look at the blue line represents the emissions reported by the country, and then if you take the average baseline emissions of all JI projects, it would mean that the emissions would have been much higher in the absence of these projects. They would have been where the red line is. And so that's not plausible somehow. And either the GHG inventory is wrong or the baseline is wrong. But it's unplausible that suddenly the emission rate would go up extremely in the period 2008 to 2012. So the key findings which we have here is that overall we found a relatively poor environmental integrity of JI under track 1 and a much better one under track 2. This had considerable implications on greenhouse gas emissions. And the reason is that most ERUs came from economies in transition which had a lot of hot air. So the targets were high, they didn't need to do anything. And so if you then transfer this hot air to other countries, it leads to an increase in global emissions. And our estimates, that's about 600 million tons CO2 equivalent, and in the EU ETS specifically 400 million tons CO2 equivalent. As I highlighted, inconsistencies with GHG inventories as a cross-cutting issue which we found. We found also varying levels of transparency. So some countries provided all the information, monitoring reports, verification reports, whereas there were some countries where we couldn't find PDDs on the website or no monitoring reports, no verification reports under track 1. And so there was also in some instances a transparency problem. What we also heard a lot from project developers is that there was a lot of uncertainty because you needed the host country to issue the ERUs in contrast to the CDM, where they were issued by the CDM executive board. So many project developers faced a lot of uncertainties whether they will ever see the ERUs and whether their projects are approved. And that was also a major problem under JI. So I think there are a number of important lessons to be learned for Article 6. So first of all, and that was already said also by Gareth and by Aki, I think the key issue is if you have ambitious targets, you have incentives to ensure environmental integrity. So what we saw in countries like Germany and France, which have relatively ambitious targets, that they only approved few projects and they really looked that these projects have environmental integrity. For example, in Germany, many projects were rejected also because there were problems They avoided double counting with the EU ETS. And they imposed very stringent benchmarks, for example, on N2O projects for nitric acid production, which had to go beyond regulations. And that comes a little bit back to Gareth's questions. I think if you have ambitious targets with the E- policies, countries will have incentives to ensure that the emission reductions which are credited go beyond the policies. So that's also an interesting lesson learned, that under ambitious targets, the situation was completely different under JI than in countries which had unambitious targets. So under unambitious targets, there are no incentives for the host country to ensure the environmental integrity. And credits were just given away, projects were credited retroactively. This was a major problem. And the countries had no incentives to do so. So a key question for me is how to avoid disincentives under the Paris Agreement to set targets unambitiously. And that's a very hard challenge, I think. And there may be different solutions to that. One solution could be to form carbon clubs, which have ambitious targets, and they say we only trade among each other. Another option could also, of course, be to set limits in some way on international transfers. There are proposals by Brazil, for example, being put forward to say, how can you ensure through eligibility requirements or limits that if you have a lot of hot air, you can't just sell and trade that. But of course, these are also politically difficult to agree upon, and one would need to assess how they technically work. But that's a big question, how to avoid these disincentives. And I think then ensuring environmental integrity could be done, and that's important, could be done in principle at two levels. Like either you look at the mechanism level and you try to ensure appropriate design of mechanisms. So you have oversight on auditors, robust methodologies to assess additionality, no retroactive crediting, etc. So you really try to design your mechanism appropriately. Or alternatively, or both maybe, you could try to ensure integrity at the country level, where you introduce such eligibility requirements or limits, and you say, look, if you want to participate, either through international rules or carbon clubs, you need to have a certain ambition. And if you have ambition by the country has incentives to ensure the integrity of units which are internationally transferred. So in principle, there are really two ways to ensure that. So another key issue, of course, is robust accounting. So under the JI, under the Kyoto framework, we have multi-year absolute emission budgets using the same GWP values for multi-year budgets. Under the Paris Agreement, we have single-year targets, we have GHG targets, we have non-GHG targets. People intend to use different GWP values. That creates a lot of trouble for robust accounting. And so there are different ways to solve that. But I think what is one aspect which is key is that you need to have trajectories of emissions or emission budgets or something like that to have robust accounting in place. Like really with only single year targets, it's very difficult to achieve robust accounting. So this is one of the major challenges I think which we have, and where the Kyoto provides us a lessons learned. That was a very robust accounting system. As I said, the two other issues I've already mentioned. Transparency, I think, was one of the key issues. So I think it's important that both under Article 6.2 and Article 6.4, it will be much easier, but also under 6.2 that transparency is provided. And lastly, the issue of certainty for investors, which is also, of course, important. Thank you very much. And here are the three publications. So we have the full study, which we did last year, a policy brief, and the case of the F-gas projects in Russia was also published in Nature Climate Change. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much indeed. Any questions? Any points of clarification for Lambert? No. Okay, good. Thank you very much. So now we will move to our final. Here we go. Very good, Benoit. The floor is yours.
Okay, thanks, Gareth. So I've been on the JISC since 2008, and when I joined the JISC, I said that the future of CDM was JI, and the future of JI was death. So that comes back to your 10th point. Will offsetting have a permanent life in the carbon market circus? I don't believe so, but we'll get back to it during my presentation. I'll walk you through 6 lessons we've taken from Article 6. This is a brief paper that we've put out recently. It's a very short paper, so I would strongly encourage you to read it. I will possibly repeat some things which have been said by Gareth, Aki, and Lambert, but I know that education is the mother, repetition is the mother of education. So, you know, we'll just say the very same things in different wordings. Okay, first lesson that we've learned from Article 6 under the KP. Additionality and baseline, it needs to be ensured given that we have hot air in the system. Lambert and Aki told about hot air under the KP. The bad piece of news is there's still hot air in the system under the existing information that we have today. If you add up all INDCs to 2030, we are not on a 2-degree trajectory. Now, if we want to stick to the Paris Agreement and make it to our 2-degree trajectory, one sensible idea would be to assess the baseline and the additionality of projects under Article 6 against this 2-degree trajectory. Now, that possibly indicates that we need carbon budgets, or I would like to say carbon trajectories more than budgets. See a little bit further than the next 5 years, possibly. I forgot to say before my introduction, I was delighted to see Gareth make a keynote speech. Having someone from the African Development Bank introduce a joint implementation side event is something delightful. And I'm very happy to see it. Lesson 2, timeline and permanence. In our view, this is critical given the implicit need for carbon sinks under the Paris Agreement. If you look at the Paris Agreement, there's an implicit emphasis on carbon sinks. And if you look at what the world will look like by the end of the century, we'll have some emissions and some absorptions by sinks. So if you look at it like 80 years down the road, well, we'll still have joint implementation projects. I don't believe so. Will we have offsets? Maybe. And if we do have offsets, my reasonable bet would be that those offsets would possibly focus on agriculture and forestry. But that's my personal feeling, because at the end of the road, if we need to have net negative emissions, how do you want to produce such negative emissions if you don't use some kind of sink? So maybe if we look 80 years down the road, one sensible idea would be to focus on, inter alia, on forestry and agriculture projects. I don't know about agriculture under the CDM, but as far as I know, forestry has a pretty poor track record, both under joint implementation and CDM. We don't know how to deal with non-permanence. It's very difficult to deal with, and that's possibly one of the issues I would like to add to the points made by the previous speakers. Third lesson, monitoring uncertainty is very poorly dealt with under the existing joint implementation scheme. In our view, it has to be taken into account given the different sectors' uncertainty and monitoring costs. You don't have the same certainty and the same monitoring costs on different sectors. Just to name a few sectors where uncertainty is quite high and monitoring costs possibly very high: agriculture, forestry, transportation, that's a few of those sectors. So if we move forward with an Article 6 mechanism, I would strongly advocate that we provide some kind of incentive to reduce uncertainty. There's many ways we can do that, possibly with discounting factors. The goal would be to strike a balance between uncertainty and monitoring costs while allowing projects to go ahead. Fourth lesson, if there's one thing to be kept from the existing UN system, UN accredited system under the CDM and JI, that would possibly be the accrediting system for the auditors. Okay, auditors sometimes perform well, sometimes they perform poorly. That's why we need a carrot and stick approach. We need to be able to suspend auditors if they don't work properly. Among the innovations that we've seen under the existing accreditation scheme over the 10 years, more than 10 years of operation of JI, that's the use of materiality, for one thing, which has greatly reduced transaction costs, and the possible suspension. We've seen suspension from auditors, which is, I mean, the stick is always useful if you want auditors to work properly. But overall, the accreditation system works quite fine, and we've seen some converging evolution between the joint implementation accreditation system and the CDM accreditation system. Joint and converging evolution is usually a good sign. It means that something is badly needed. Fifth lesson, and I guess I'll repeat what Aki and Lambert have said, centralized governance is paramount in our view. As the JISC were proposed as early as 2010 to have one single track for joint implementation rather than two tracks. I won't go over what Aki and Lambert said. I concur very much with their conclusions. Many projects are highly questionable in terms of additionality, and the bulk of those projects is actually under track 1, which possibly indicates that we need to have some kind of governance at the UNFCCC level. That doesn't mean that the UNFCCC and its bodies must do everything. Some things must be delegated to the national authorities because we're talking about projects and policies being implemented at the domestic level. But overall, we need some oversight, and to provide good oversight, we need some transparency. As pointed out by the previous speakers, it's very hard to come up with the documentation for some projects, and that's an understatement. Sixth lesson in the stringency versus costs. I'm afraid Aki will never get a perfect project-based mechanism. The idea is rather to get as close as possible to this perfect project-based mechanism if we can. Transaction costs are an extremely important issue. They vary greatly between and among sectors. There's a scale effect. The larger the project, the lower the transaction costs in general. They vary from more than $1 per ton of CO2 abated to several cents per ton abated. If on top of that, if you take into account that additionality demonstration and baseline setting can cover roughly 50% of upfront costs, that's a good argument for trying to reduce those costs. I believe there's many lessons to be taken, not so much from JI, but rather from CDM in terms of streamlining, doing standardizing, etc. That's possibly things we can take on board. Seventh and last slide, do not reinvent the wheel. This is a skateboard with square wheels, and it does work. It's quite innovative, but I don't believe we need to be that innovative in reinventing market-based mechanisms, quote unquote, or Article 6 mechanism. What we need is stringent but flexible MRV system. We possibly need some standardized baselines, monitoring methodologies, and we have loads of them, and we need accredited auditors. Do not repeat all mistakes is possibly as important as do not reinvent the wheel. Define additionality against the 2-degree target. That's possibly one way to avoid hot air. How to do it? That's an open question, but I guess that's a lot of work for researchers. So that's possibly why I'm saying it. To be honest, I don't have a clue as to how to do it, but that's the what to do that I'm trying to highlight. Second thing, in terms of all mistakes, international oversight and transparency. I believe, if I may have a personal opinion, I believe the SBI work on the review of the JI guidelines is working in the right direction. The JISC, for example, shall evaluate the conformity of the national implementation of JI against the international standards. That's possibly how we can draw the line between what needs to be done at the national level and what needs to be done at the international level. And one of the mistakes we as the JISC have done, even though I was not part of the JISC when we did that mistake, I take the full blame for it because I would have done the very same mistake if I had joined the JISC a couple of years earlier. That's the prompt start issue. We decided not to credit those projects that had begun operation before the JISC was fully operational. That was a major mistake because it essentially killed JI Track 2. And that's possibly something we shouldn't have done. Most of the projects went through Track 1, which possibly was very detrimental in terms of environmental impact. So that's all in a nutshell. If I have one reaction to what I've said and what I've heard from the previous speakers, what we've looked at so far is the operation of JI under the existing environment. That is, with hot air and with someone who was willing to buy ERUs, the EU ETS. An open question to the audience: will we have the very same environment in the coming years? Will we have a buyer for ERUs? I question it. Will it be a market, even though it's a market-based mechanism? That's an open question. Having a market-based mechanism doesn't mean you have a market. So in my view, Article 6 could very much look like domestic implementation of mitigation policies and or mitigation projects with an international recognition doesn't necessarily flow through markets, if you want my take on that. Okay, thanks, Gareth, and thanks.
Okay. So thank you very much indeed, Benoit, and indeed to all three of our presenters. I think, well, we've certainly seen, you know, some good reviews. I think you know, to the questions that you know, that I think are you know, are challenging us as to whether or not we can make a sustainable development mechanism work under the Paris Agreement. So maybe I've got three questions I'd just like to give to all three of our speakers, and to pick from it, whichever one you want to address, or maybe four questions, and then please, I'm going to turn to the audience. So so please get ready with your questions. First of all, nobody's touched on the concept of discounting, and is a ton? Oh, you did. Okay, sorry, I might have been talking to my neighbor at that time. So is discounting a valid approach? Is a ton? Because that was one of the mantras under the Kyoto Protocol. Are we moving away from that? We've heard quite a bit about additionality and its links to environmental integrity and so on. I think Lambert covered that very well. If countries are declaring the units that they export, if they declare them in their national inventory, do we need to have an additionality tool, or, you know, or could you just say it's up to the countries to decide? And indeed, do you think countries will want that decision-making authority as part of their participation in the Paris Agreement? You know, they didn't join the Paris Agreement to be told what they can do and cannot do. And then my third point is what's the timescale to resolve this? I mean, we're starting, you know, we've got a 2020 start date, but obviously we'd like to get started before. ICAO's coming along. There's going to be airlines that want to get involved in this stuff maybe sooner. You know, is it possible that we can have a working mechanism? One of the big incentives for the CDM was a prompt start component to it. You know, that really kick-started things, and people got right in there because of the prompt start, and yet we've heard we shouldn't have that. And my fourth point, which you might want to just touch on, is you know, we're talking here about international transactions, and we've heard a mention of carbon clubs, and then finally a little bit about domestic units. You know, the idea, and for example, South Africa have a concept for a carbon tax that is then linked to domestic emission reduction projects. And I'm 100% in favor of that. I think that's a great way to go. And it's fundamentally different from the idea of international transfers, because it all happens within a national inventory. And then everything that we've learned from all the projects and the baselines, all that stuff is completely relevant. So, you know, can you expand a little bit on that as to what role you might see for domestic offsetting activities, learning from what we've done in the past as opposed to international? So we'll just go along, I think, as we sit, and you pick up on one or two of those points for a minute or two, and then I'll turn to the floor for questions. Thank you. Aki.
Specifically, I think it's very clear that tons are not tons. The greenhouse, the warming potentials of different gases may be equalized around the world, but the mitigation potentials of different countries are very, very different. The costs of mitigation in different countries are very different. The growth trajectories of different countries are very different. If we expect all countries to peak as soon as possible and to then reduce their emissions very quickly, then the opportunities and the price signal that different countries will need are going to be very different, and it's going to be very clear that tons are not tons around the world. And one global price for carbon is not going to be a solution, because for many countries that will not have a high enough price to give that incentive to decarbonize. Will countries want that responsibility? I don't think they will. I think many countries lack capacity. I think it's for many countries who missed out very much on more the CDM, their lack of capacity led to a failure in the success of that. Their failure in the overall market. I don't think that they will want that responsibility, because will mean a repeat of their experience, especially for for LDCs in the CDM. And I do think that there is a role for domestic offsetting. I think that if there is a cheap mitigation potential in countries that is hard to regulate, that there is a potential for independent private sector actors to go out and seek out those cheaper mitigation options. But I think it's also going to be very important for those countries to keep those mitigation outcomes domestically in order to meet their own targets. And I would argue that although comparatively France and Germany had more ambitious Kyoto targets, obviously they could have been more ambitious if they're going to be selling off their JI units. Could have been and should have been.
Thank you, Lambert.
Yeah, on interesting questions, I think. on the discounting one, I think, yes, in principle, discounting can to some extent address the uncertainty of your additionality or your emission reductions. And I think it's interesting that under JI, there was one country which applied discounting. It was France. So they generally applied a discount of 10% under JI to projects. I think one important issue to understand, though, is that discounting doesn't necessarily lead to an overall mitigation, what we aim for under 6.4, because if you do discounting under capped environments, if France issues a 10% discount, it allows France to do elsewhere less to achieve its targets outside the JI project. So I think it's important to understand that conservative baselines or discounting doesn't necessarily lead to an atmospheric benefit. So it doesn't necessarily lead to aggregatedly less emissions to the atmosphere. And if that's what we want to achieve under Article 6.4, you need some accounting rules to achieve that. And purely discounting is not sufficient. So that's an important aspect. And maybe I think the South African tax and the combination with credits from offsets projects, I think that's an interesting route, and I assume that some countries may do that. Also, I think that one needs to bear in mind two issues. One is that I would say the concept of crediting has some inherent limitations, which is the uncertainty of additionality, etc., which are difficult to solve, right? So probably these countries would limit the projects which can be credited to those where you have a higher likelihood of achieving additionality, and then the potential may not be as large. So that's basically what we saw in a number of Western European countries which allowed JI. But if you look to the potential, it was relatively limited. Also because you have climate policies which overlap, etc., for various reasons. But also there weren't so many projects where no policy was in place. And so I think it's a good possibility. And I think countries should pursue that or evaluate that, but it also has some limitations compared to other policy instruments like ETS, which automatically cover all emission sources and provide an incentive to all sectors. So that's maybe important. Maybe one last word on the question of prompt start. Maybe it's not such a prompt start question, but there's a lot of talk here about transitioning and whether CDM or JI projects could fall under Article 6 and whether the reductions could continue after 2020 or whether even some banking takes place, etc. And I think there I would signal some caution because this can have different impacts depending on what you bank. And there are many projects which are up and running and they generate emission reductions anyways. And so the carbon revenues have been written off. And so if you reward them, you issue credits for reductions from a today's perspective, which happen anyhow. And then if you bank them, it could lead in some instances to lower ambition. But and it could lead to continued low market prices also. So the question is whether you want to incentivize new projects and additional mitigation, then you may need to think how to do that and what projects to focus on, or whether you should really to allow this hangover or this surplus which we have to carry on under the Paris Agreement. Thank you.
I guess I'll take the one on prompt start. I guess we've had the prompt start that was called CDM and JI, and I would strongly agree with Lambert in terms of being very cautious with a potential prompt start under Article 6. I'll take the one on domestic versus international. If you look at what happened under JI in the past years, actually it was not so much about having an international mechanism. It was much more about having domestic projects being implemented on a national territory and having them recognized under the UNFCCC and getting the cash out of the UETS. That's basically how the economic model of joint implementation worked. In the future, I guess we'll keep the domestic component part. Article 6 will, in my view, be very much like domestic reductions with an international recognitions. As I said, but there are two separate things. There is emission reductions on the one hand and international recognition. Under the Paris Agreement, countries can do whatever they want to do to reduce emissions. The only thing is, if they want to have it recognized under Article 6, they need to go through a certain process, which still needs to be devised, but they can do anything under Article 6. To alleviate the concerns on additionality and baseline, I mean, there is one way to do it with it, which is discounting factors, etc. I would have another hint. If you want to make sure your projects are super additional, there is one ministry to bring on board, the Ministry of Finance. That's to relate to your point number 2, sovereign assets. The minute the Minister of Finance understands we have a sovereign asset, I can assure you that they make sure that the project is extremely additional. We've had a very strong experience in France, and if you want to make sure they are additional, those projects, please do it. The result is outstanding.
Okay, thank you very much. Do you want to ask a question? Or, yep. Yeah, sorry, I'll hand over to you first for one more question.
Oh, okay, that's on. Thank you. A fascinating remark on the Ministry of Finance. In Germany, in our court cases, we didn't have the Ministry of Finance on board. And so we had to rely on the only thing we had and to ensure additionality actually of the projects and to enforce the reduced baselines. And these were the rules that we had. And these were actually the Marrakesh Accords that actually the outcomes of the court cases were decided on. So I would strongly say to you, Gareth, international rules are important. Host countries cannot be expected to fully understand all the implications of what they are going to get themselves into. And very strong and clear international rules are the best resource for host countries also to rely on to ensure environmental integrity. But I have two questions, actually. I think, well, we think here in this question and answer terms, but of course, if you come to then the implementation, it becomes problems and solutions. And the question is, do we have sufficiently good candidates or options for solutions for all the problems? Or is there stuff that we cannot solve currently? Or will we come up with something? And the things that I think are candidates for nightmares in the future. You have identified some of them. One for me is the uneven playing field with a global price, and this will come down as regional distribution and sectoral distribution. How to address the varying mitigation and transaction costs among countries, that would be one question. Comprehensiveness, how can we make sure all mitigation opportunities are on board? And the long-term target, balancing emission sources and sinks by 2050, the long-term objective of the Paris Agreement. Will there be a time horizon, or what should it be for phasing out offsetting?
Okay, panelists, a quick comment on any of those, and then thank you for your patience. We'll come to the floor.
I'll take the one on phasing out. I guess you need to look at Article 2 and 4 of the Paris Agreement before the end of the 21st century is possibly a good response. Comprehensiveness on the comprehensiveness, how do we make sure every emission reduction opportunity is on board? It's funny to see how countries lack imagination in some respects. under joint implementation, at least under track 2, anything was possible. Any emission reduction was possible. And still, we don't have any CCS project, as far as I know, not under track 2, while on the other end, like CDM project developers were asking for a CDM methodology for CCS. It was possible under track 2. No one did it. We could have possibly policy joint implementation. No one did it. So it's not so much a matter of making sure that everything is doable, but rather possibly capacity building for countries and making sure they understand the opportunities brought about by Article 6.
Yeah, I'd like to pick on the uneven playing field. I think we are already today in a situation where we do not have one carbon market price, but we have a lot of different prices, and there are different entities targeting different regions and project types. So you have World Bank initiatives like the CDEF, which particularly look into rural development, etc., and they pay much higher prices than you got on the normal market. And the same as for the pilot auction facility, where specific project types options are auctioned, and they get much higher prices. So I don't think we will turn back to this world where you have one price and more expensive mitigation options are left out. I could imagine that there will be different windows and different markets focusing on different mitigation options in different countries and having different prices. And in that scenario, I'm sure that there will be countries who will focus on LDCs, for example, and are willing to pay higher prices for that. So I think this issue will be possible to address that in some ways.
Yeah, I mean, it's clear that it's an uneven playing field, and it's just the way the world is. Different countries have different capacities, have different income levels, have different mitigation options. They need different prices to take the mitigation action. They need different levels of support, climate finance, capacity building, technology transfer. The world is just an uneven playing field, and it's not a practicable solution to pretend that it's not. How fast do we need to phase out offsetting? I would say immediately.
Very good. All right, thank you very much for those responses. Now I'm going to open it up to the floor. Do we have a microphone? I've got 3 questions. Actually, I've got 4 questions, but well, let me take the first 3, 1, 2, 3, and then we'll come to you there. But Joyce, have you got the microphone? Can you start with this gentleman over here, please? So if you can please just say who you are and who you're addressing your question to, please. And if you can keep the questions short, we have about 15 minutes left.
Thank you very much. My name is Dimitar. I'm Dimitar Nikov. I'm working for the French Ministry of Environment, and I'm involved in GI and negotiations on markets. I'll try to be quick. The questions are to the whole panel, maybe a little bit also to Benoit on specific points, but the questions are, so my first remark is just a remark regarding the French scheme and regarding ambition. So does it mean that a country should have an ambitious target in order to be sure that we have something good in place, a good scheme? I'm not very sure actually, because in France we had some surplus at the end, some AU surplus. I don't know about Germany, I believe so. And at the same time, the projects are not bad. So I think it's ambition, but also a question of responsibility. And this will come in play when we discuss the Paris Agreement, because in Paris Agreement, everybody is responsible towards the 2 degrees. On the other hand, I wanted to ask you a very practical question on one of the things that can be taken directly from GI into Article 6.4, which is the determination report. Do we need a determination report under, for instance, economy-wide targets, parties developing Article 6.4 scheme? And my last point, it was about just a comment in regards of the demand. It's to Benoit. Well, the demand, I don't know if we'll have demand on offsets, but on CRs at least, we know that Corsia is already mentioning that they may be interested. So in this respect, on 6.4, there may be some demand for offsets.
Okay, thank you. Can you pass the microphone along to the lady in the middle, please?
Thank you. I'm Christine Kaya. I coordinate the Parliamentary Forum on Climate Change, Uganda. We have been looking out for non-market approaches under Article 6. I'm requesting for all of you, if you can share with us what has worked elsewhere so well under non-market approaches. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And then I think there was one more gentleman. Yes, yes, please.
Yeah, thank you very much. My name is Wolfgang Obergassel. I work with the Wuppertal Institute in Germany. First of all, thank you very much for this excellent panel. I guess Gareth didn't get many answers, but you basically laid out the whole research agenda we have to deal with and the political agenda for the next years. I just wanted to highlight that there's some more lessons to be learned for Article 6 at national and subnational levels, because there as well, especially in federal systems, where you also have federal states and municipalities pursuing climate policies, you also in the past already very often have the question of, okay, there are policies at various levels and all of them want to claim credit. So does the federal state get the credit for the emission reductions, or the national government, or the municipality? There's actually been a lot of work already done on this issue of how to integrate the different levels of policies into baselines and additionality. This is very interesting to be looked at, I think, for Article 6.
Okay, thank you very much. And since that's more of a comment, I think we'll take the last question from this gentleman here, and then we'll have a second round. No, it's the gentleman with the microphone. Go ahead.
Thank you. It's Matthias Honegger with Perspectives and the Institute for Advanced Sustainability Studies in Potsdam. And my question goes along the lines of what you actually alluded to, Benoit, with regard to CCS. And it's actually going a step beyond CCS. It's looking at the CDM experience, the JEI experience, and what does that tell us about mobilizing negative emissions technologies? Is there a vision, maybe also for Konrad Reischke-Kessler, from Germany, is there a vision behind how to mobilize those? And to all of you as well. Thank you.
Okay, very good. So let's take some answers to those, and then we'll come around for a second round. Benoit, there was a few addressed to you. I don't know if you want to pick up on either of those. I'll address, Christine, your question from Uganda. You're my favorite audience member at the moment, so I'll come to you. Go ahead.
Well, first of all, for Dimitar's question, do we need a determination report for parties? If I got the question right, my answer would be yes. We need a determination report for parties. Okay, I understand you don't agree. We'll discuss it bilaterally. No worries. Where will demand for offsets come from? That was the second question. I don't know if you guys had a clue. I don't believe it will come from other countries. I mean, the primary source won't be from other national jurisdictions, but possibly from policies implemented by those jurisdictions. For example, if the South African scheme decides to import credits from somewhere else, that could be a possibility. And that would be my take. I don't believe in an international carbon market at all, but possibly in linked carbon markets at a very small scale in the future. How to mobilize, Matthias' question, how to mobilize negative emissions. Good point. That was an open question. I mean, as I said, we've had a very hard time having project proponents for CCS, for example. Forestry is not a success story under joint implementation, and that's an understatement. Are market-based mechanisms the right tool to incentivize such emission reductions? I don't know. But I wouldn't like to, I mean, negative emissions, as you pointed, I mean, as you call them, that's the end of the story, but we need to reduce emissions first and foremost, even though we know that 50 years down the road, we'll also need some negative emissions. I mean, I hate the expression, but I mean, you get the idea, absorptions by 6. I guess I'll stop there.
Yeah, I'd like to pick on the question of international oversight. I think that's a very good question. When do we need international oversight or not? And I think from an incentive perspective, theoretically, you need international oversight under 2 circumstances, where you have the risk that targets are not ambitious. So you have a target, the country has an economy-wide target, but there may not be ambition, and you have risks of hot air. Then you could, through international oversight, you could ensure that the units have integrity, or that the country cannot transfer, that there are limits to transfer. These are the 2 ways. or where countries have targets which cover part of the economy, and you have you are in uncapped environments, like you're in a CDM world, then you also need some type of international oversight. And there are, of course, different levels, I think, to ensure integrity. So these are the two situations. And then you have a third situation where it's in the scope of NDCs and you have ambitious NDCs. There, theoretically, you wouldn't need any international oversight because the country has incentives to ensure integrity. But can we distinguish ambitious from non-ambitious NDCs? I mean, that's self-determined. It's a very difficult debate. And so maybe in the end, a solution could be to have some international oversight in any case. So it's a difficult issue. I just wanted to pick very briefly on international demand. I think we shouldn't forget we have now a mechanism under ICAO. There are some countries who still want to buy. There's results-based finance. So probably we will not have this big market again, but I think there will be some demand and some transfers taking place.
On the point that France had leftover AAUs and still good projects, I would say that not all countries are France and not all countries are Germany. And the independence of different institutions to enforce the stringency of different things and the different incentive structures in different countries are very, very variable. And we can't go around the world thinking that all countries have the same capacities and same institutions and same rule of law capacities as Western Europe. Touching on the CORSIA issue, I do see international aviation as being the major, probably, source of demand going forward. I think that also the UNFCCC needs to think very hard about how much of a contribution aviation needs to be making towards the overall goal. And is the CORSIA going to be enough? And if we're getting back to the question of offsetting in general, is offsetting going to be enough for specifically international aviation? On the subnational comments, I think it's also clear that we are in a body that is focused on national sovereigns. And it's not that the actions of subnational states and provinces are not important, but very recently we also experienced that these things are fluid. The UK may leave the EU. There are different levels of governance, but this forum is based on states, and states need to enforce things on their subnational governments and also can take credit for them when they take further action. And just to touch on the issue of negative emissions, we can't use negative emissions as an excuse to take less action now, and especially when it comes to agriculture and forestry. In many countries, these are very tightly, these issues are very tightly related to human rights, food security, and we also cannot accept the argument that the necessity of, or eventual necessity of negative emissions should come on at the price of human rights violations or reduced food security.
Okay, Christine, I'll just address your question very quickly. I don't think there's been a lot of progress on non-market-based approaches. However, the African Development Bank has made a proposal to develop an adaptation benefit mechanism, which we're pitching as a non-market mechanism. And I'll see, instead of going into detail now, maybe we can talk offline afterwards. I'll hand now to Conrad because there was a question for him, and then Patrick, we'll take your question, and then we'll move to Albert.
I'm not sure I can say something substantially different from Aki on negative emissions and offsetting. CCS has not taken off spectacularly under the CDM, as you know, but the past is not necessarily a good indicator for the future. Will negative emissions be the only possible application in the long term for offsetting projects? Possibly, but will they be possible taking into account safeguards and sustainable development criteria? I don't know. Certainly fascinating research questions.
Okay, so I had one more question at the front here, and I didn't see anybody else asking for the floor, so we're closed for questions. Last question, Patrick. Do you have another microphone? No, still not working.
Hello?
Okay.
No. My name is Patrick Berge from South Pole Group. Have one comment and one question. Comment is rather a challenge, Gareth, to one of your 10 amendments. And I think you painted a rather bleak role for the private sector, citing the risk that they would go for the low-hanging fruits and could crowd out the public sector investment. But I think it's important to keep in mind also that according to the International Energy Agency, we will need around $16.5 trillion in investments over the next 15 years. That's about 1.1 trillion in investments per year on average. And if we compare that to the amount of public money that is available, if we look at the 100 billion we have under the Paris Agreement, it's really a drop in the ocean. So I think there is no way around private sector participation. The question is, how will that happen? I think a lot of it will happen within the context of national policies and schemes. But I do also see a role for private sector investments under international cooperative approaches, especially in countries that have difficult access to finance. Yeah, so I think that's just important to keep in mind. And the question is, you cited the potential role of carbon clubs, and we always talk about the ambitious carbon clubs. I think being very skeptical about the track 1 under JI, I would love to see the concept of ambitious carbon clubs working, and I think they could work, but I also see the risk of non-ambitious carbon clubs and a potential race to the bottom in these bilateral cooperative approaches. So what kind of mechanisms can we put in place in order to avoid such a race to the bottom? Is naming and shaming enough, or can we do more?
Okay, thank you very much. Quickly, who wants to address that last point on the ambitious versus non-ambitious carbon clubs? Benoit, go ahead.
Well, my point, I mean, my answer to you, Patrick, would be much more general. Countries need to understand it's their long-term interest to decarbonize their economies, full stop. Of course, we have to deal with short-term competitiveness issues, blah, 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 etc. But in the longer term, I'm quite confident that investing in fossil fuel, for example, will be a bad economic choice. So that's what countries need to understand. When, that's another question.
Okay, good. So thank you very much indeed. Now I'm going to hand over to the Honourable Albert Williams to give us a little bit of a wrap up. Albert, the floor is yours. It's on. It's on.
Thank you very much. Good afternoon, everyone. I will not do the wrap up, but I just like to make probably three points on the very discussion from the panel. Firstly, I think it's more on the role of the JISC or the JI. We have been able to, over the last 2 years, we've realized the need to scale down our work more or less based on what has happened on the market. So I think it's something that we see the need, and I think from the commitment or the decision from Paris Agreement, especially on Article 6, just provides some positive direction, not only for JI, but for the market, for market mechanisms that will need to be developed over time. I think the point of not reinventing the wheel is one which is something that I believe is very, very important in this respect. The other thing, coming from a small island developing state, the amendment to Doha is one that we would like to see being fast-tracked to make sure the issue of hot air can be captured with the amendments. I think we've seen the fast ratification of the Paris Agreement, and we would also like to see the amendments to the Doha ratification rather. I think lastly,
as an NDC or as a small island developing state, I think we have submitted our INDC or NDCs, and the question that we have goes back to what a colleague from Cambia, I believe, asked, what mechanisms are in place. We as a politician, we currently being asked questions on whether carbon the markets are there to support initiatives we have in the islands with small population, small island states, on how that could help us either sell credits or benefits from the mechanisms that are currently in place. Thank you very much again. I think we've had it's been a learning experience for me with the panel, with the experts on the room too. Thank you.
Very good. Well, ladies and gentlemen, I'd like you to join me in thanking our panelists. And you've been listening to Lessons Learned from JI towards Article 6.